You know him as Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube. If not, you should really follow that channel. It's so inspiring, and you always get stuff to think about, a new dimension or something like that. Anyways, I think it's better to leave the English talking to Alex. A warm applause.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. I do appreciate you accommodating a Briton like myself and allowing me to speak my native language. I always feel bad traveling in Europe because people have made such an effort to learn the English language, and I don't even know how to say hello in Norwegian. I feel like I'm kind of getting away with it. I guess the cost is that other speakers just could be talking absolute smack about me to my face, and I'd have absolutely no idea. So I'm hoping that that's not the case. Although I do, to some degree, hope that that's the case, because when I'm invited to speak to an audience about animal ethics, I often struggle because I kind of can't stand being in a room full of people who agree with me. I don't really see the point. And oftentimes when I attend conferences and talks, it seems like there's a self-congratulatory air about things that I always seek to avoid. So I want to be able to talk about something that's actually going to be of value and potentially something a little bit new. My greatest joy when talking about animal ethics is simply making the case to people that animal suffering matters, that factory farming is an inexcusable abomination. But I don't think that would do much here. And so what I think I've travelled to your country today to do is to offer some advice or to offer some techniques as to how to have more effective communication. Now, of course, because this is a vegan conference, this will be focusing on the issue of animal ethics in particular, but hopefully this isn't something that needs to be restricted to just that area, because these ideas can be used more broadly. I don't exactly consider myself an expert, but I have been professionally debating people and ideas now for since I was a teenager at any rate, so I can at least speak to having some experience. The reason I think this is important is because vegans have, it would be foolish to deny, something of a reputational problem. They're seen as extreme and radical and annoying and pushy. And so for that reason, I think that one of the greatest duties that a communicator of animal ethics has is to fight against these perceptions and to do so clearly and in such a way that makes somebody focus on the message rather than the messenger. So hopefully we can talk about a few things that will help us to get there. I'm sometimes asked if it's an obligation to be an activist. That is, if something is a moral obligation to do, is it also a moral obligation to be out in the streets campaigning for that cause? Is that also an obligation, or is it enough just to do the thing itself? If you're a vegan and you think that's an obligation, is it also an obligation to partake in vegan activism? I don't just think that it's permissible to not partake in activism. In some cases, I think it might be mandatory to not participate in vegan activism because a lot of people are simply fantastically bad at it. And I think that before we try to do such a thing, we need to make sure that we're in a position to actually effectively communicate to people. You know, if we imagine this idea that in order to be a good moral person, you have to be out in the streets doing everything you can to try to win everybody round, then if you're new to the area, or if you're not a confident public speaker, or you don't do very well with confrontation, then even a bad objection that somebody raises can be enough to throw you off. Because even if what they're saying doesn't make sense, if you don't know how to respond to it or haven't encountered it before, they might go away from that feeling like they've won the conversation. And that's not because they're right, but because you were unprepared. And so I think a duty that we have is to make sure that we're in a position where we can expound intellectual virtues and honesty before we begin having these conversations. So I wrote down a few ideas that I had that hopefully aren't the most obvious things in the world. But I want to start with something fairly obvious, which is that point of research and preparation. Remember that when you're first engaging in this kind of stuff, when you see people arguing about veganism online, when you watch your favorite creators and this kind of thing, you're watching curated content. You're watching the best debates that they think are the most effective ones to post onto their channel. You don't see all the times that they floundered or got bested in the conversation, because that's not the kind of thing that gets posted. So what often happens is you watch this stuff, you get really enthused, you think, man, we always win the argument, because there's always an answer to any objection someone can raise, and you get into the street, somebody says something to you that you weren't expecting, and you're a bit stuck. So what you need to do is essentially study. If this is something that you want to do, if you want to be a communicator for this course, then you're going to have to study. You're going to have to watch these debates and read these books, but treat it like you're preparing for an exam. When I was at university, what we would do is every week we'd be set a bunch of reading. And the purpose of the reading was to answer an exam at the end of the year. But every single week, we were told to answer an essay. So we'd have to take that information, condense it into an essay, and hand it into a tutor to be criticized. Now that essay never went anywhere. You showed it to your tutor and that was it. It's not going to get published. I'm not putting it on my website or anything like that. It's just practice. And the same thing can be done when it comes to communication for ethical issues. Watch a discussion, watch a debate, study the issue. Try writing an essay, try writing a speech that you'll never actually deliver, and see if you're capable of doing it. Next thing to do is to listen to a debate. Go and listen to one on YouTube or something like this. Listen to the person's objection and pause the video. Think to yourself, what would I say here? Could I respond to this? If the answer is no, then you're simply not ready to be out doing this kind of thing. If the answer is yes, then say it to yourself and compare it with what the person said and see if there's any way to be improved. So it's a process of actually studying, and not just studying veganism, right? If you want to be an effective vegan communicator, you can't just study vegan ethics. You can't just study vegan environmentalism. If you want to have an ethical discussion with someone, study ethics. Don't just study vegan ethics, because otherwise all you're hearing is, again, curated philosophy. You want to have an understanding of ethics more broadly. You want to study the different schools of ethical thought and the history of this area of philosophy, and then apply it to veganism, rather than studying it through the lens of veganism at the start, because people can tell when you've done that. Same thing applies if you want to campaign for environmental veganism. You should study environmental science. Imagine somebody who was trying to convince you that veganism is the most important environmental issue and made that their cause, but didn't know anything about environmental science. It would seem ridiculous, but people do this all the time with ethics. They know all the arguments when it comes to the moral treatment of animals, but they're not ethicists. They haven't studied ethical dilemmas, ethical problems, and ethical theories outside of the context of veganism. So we must avoid getting caught out by new questions by studying more broadly for that reason. Now, one of the most important things that I want to bring to people's attention on this point is my advice to avoid the use of stock responses. This is something that I think happens all the time. Because of the fact that we engage with this media so much online, we hear objection and a response, and it usually comes in the form of a TikTok or an Instagram reel or something. And the same points come up all the time. We've heard the same people bringing up the same arguments all the time. And so when somebody brings it up to you, you think, I know this one. And if somebody mentions a particular area, it's like you have this list, this repertoire in your brain of responses that you can just call upon because you've already heard this objection before. But the problem is, if you try to rehearse these stock answers in this way, you have them all prepared and you just pull them out whenever the topic comes up, then you might be caught out, because sometimes it's not what you're expecting. You must listen to the question in its entirety and imagine that you're being asked it for the first time ever. For example, somebody might mention the death of animals in crops, in crop production. Now, everybody here will have heard this objection. Somebody says, well, look, animals are killed in the production of vegan food. And of course, people know that the way to respond to that is to point out that many more animals are dying in crop production to feed livestock than it would take to eat the crops directly. But if somebody were making a more subtle point, let's say that we were talking about a regenerative system of agriculture, a regenerative farm, and we said, look, you can kill one cow here, or you can eat some vegan food that's been imported and involved a bunch of crop deaths and environmental pollution. Now, if somebody brings up this objection and they say, but look, consider the crop deaths. What you might do is go, I know this one. Yeah, I've heard this before. I've seen how to respond to this. You're no longer listening to what that person's saying. You're just waiting for your opportunity to put forward the objection. And so they might ask you something like, look, if we don't have a right to kill animals for food, then why is it that I'm allowed to kill animals in crop production in order to eat those crops? And you might say, but didn't you know that more animals are dying in crop production to produce factory farmed livestock than if we were to eat the crops directly? And now you're just talking past this person, because they weren't asking about factory farming. They weren't even asking about minimizing suffering. They were asking a more specific question about why any creature would have the right to inflict any amount of suffering upon another animal for the sake of their own survival. And that requires a different kind of response. That requires a sense in which you think that human beings have a right to put themselves first. Because if you didn't, if you really couldn't kill any animals in the production of any food, then you wouldn't be able to eat anything, at least as it currently stands. And that's the issue you need to address. But if you're not careful, when somebody mentions crop deaths and you think, I know the answer to this, you're going to completely talk past them. Similarly, imagine if somebody says, well, what about lions eating gazelles? And you go, I know this one. Yeah, I know this one. And you think, I'm ready to say, yeah, but lions also kill each other and assault each other, and we wouldn't want to be doing that. But again, you're not listening to what they're saying, because maybe what they're going to say is something like, well, if lions kill gazelles and kill lots of gazelles, then even if it's not the lion's fault, we don't blame the lion for doing that. Isn't it still beneficial to prevent the lion from doing that, to kill the lion, because then less gazelles are ultimately going to die? Because by killing that one lion, you're stopping all of these other animals from being killed by that lion? And that's a much more interesting question, and it involves a discussion of wild animal suffering and intervening in nature in order to reduce animal suffering, which is a totally different question. But because people like to rely on these stock responses, you end up completely missing the question and going with the wrong response. So even if you think you know the best way to respond to a question as soon as the words start coming out of somebody's mouth, please listen to the question in its entirety and make sure that you fully understand what they're saying. One of the best ways to do that is to repeat it back to them. Make sure that you actually understand the question before you answer it. Try to restate their position in the strongest possible terms before responding to it to make sure that you've actually got it right, because there's no point engaging with an argument that somebody didn't actually make. So avoid phrases like, I think this ties into the question of, I hear this all the time, politicians are very good at this too. This is what people hate about politicians. When you listen to an interview and they have this stock response that they've been told by their spin doctors to say, and it doesn't matter what the interviewer asks, they keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. There's a very famous clip of a British interviewer called Jeremy Paxman, and sometime in the 80s there was a minister called Michael Howard who was being asked a question about whether he threatened to overrule somebody, and Jeremy Paxman in this interview says, did you threaten to overrule him? And the interviewer says, I did not overrule him. And Jeremy Paxman says, but did you threaten to overrule him? He's like, I did not overrule this, but did you threaten to? And he asks the question something like 17 times, over and over again, relentlessly. And Michael Howard just won't answer the question because he's got this rehearsed response that he's been told to say. And this is what we end up doing as well if we're not careful. Listen to the question, actually answer what's being asked of you, and give people more credit than you might want to do at first. Because you're so used to seeing this stuff online that you forget that there are people who actually do have good objections that can't be very easily answered and condensed into a TikTok, and you need to be ready for them. If you don't know the answer to a question as well, if you don't have any response, you might think, well, I need these stock responses because what if I'm caught out? It's okay to say you don't know, and in fact it's quite endearing to say that you don't know, because the person knows that you're genuinely trying to have a useful conversation and not just win them over. But one thing you can do, and this is the second thing, or piece of advice I suppose, is to rely on conditionals. And by conditionals, I mean if-then statements. We might not know the answers to these questions, but in order to have a productive conversation, we can still ask, well, if this were the case, would this be the case? And you can use this to get across your own point, but also to respond to what somebody's saying. So let's say you're arguing with somebody and they say, well, I don't think I can be vegan because veganism is very unhealthy. You can't get all the nutrients that you need. Now, your first thought might be, but I know it is healthy. I know that all of the nutritional science tells me that I can be a healthy vegan. But if you're not a nutritionist, you're going to say, but you can be healthy. And they're going to say, prove it. And you're going to say, I can't. And then you're going to look like a fool. So you think to yourself, well, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know how I can prove that this is fully nutritional. I mean, I certainly can't. I'm not a nutritional scientist. So what I do is I rely on a conditional statement. They say it's not healthy to stop eating animal products. So I say, okay, well, if it were healthy, if it were the case that it were healthy, then would it be an obligation to be a vegan? And then sometimes the person says, oh, I don't think so, for this reason or that reason. And then it's like, well, what we've done there is you've demonstrated that you made that point, not because you really think it's the thing that, you know, is preventing you from being a vegan, but just because you wanted a point to say. Now that person might say, yes, I think if it were healthy, it would be a moral obligation. And then it turns out that we actually agree. We're actually in complete fundamental agreement now, because we both think if it's healthy to be a vegan, then it's a moral obligation to be a vegan. The only difference now is a factual dispute that can be cleared up with a simple Google search later in the day. That's a far more effective conversation to have with somebody than simply mumbling about, yeah, but I think the American Dietetics Association or Academy or whatever it's called, they said something about veganism. It's just not going to convince a person. And they're also going to think that you're just trying to steamroll them with facts. If you say, well, yeah, I can understand that. Of course, if it's not healthy, then I wouldn't be doing it. But I think if it is healthy, it must be a moral obligation. And then you can talk about that conditional instead. So, yeah, and you can also grant this the other way. You know, if you're going to get them to grant such things, you need to be able to answer conditionals in the same way. So maybe you would grant that in that same conversation, you could say, oh, and if it were unhealthy, if it were actually the case that, you know, that children couldn't properly develop on a vegan diet, then I think it would be okay not to raise them on a vegan diet. Now, it doesn't matter whether you think it is or not. What matters is you've demonstrated to this person that you're open to actually following the facts where they lead, and you're reasonable enough that were new information to come along, you would change your mind. You may also have to grant different conditionals depending on your views. Like, if you're primarily caring about animal agriculture because of the suffering of animals, if you're like a utilitarian, somebody might say, but animals don't really suffer. Animals don't feel pain. Again, you've got two choices here. You could say, yes, they do. Now, this is what I think I can do this because I'm a philosopher by trade, and so I like to talk about the philosophy of qualia, of pain, what it means to feel pain, how we can know if somebody feels pain, but maybe that's not something that you've thought about before. And so when someone says, animals don't feel pain, you could say, yes, they do. They say, prove it. You say, I can't, and then you look like a fool again. Or you say, okay, if animals don't feel pain, then yeah, it's fine to do all this stuff to them. It's fine to, you know, put an animal in a cage. If it doesn't feel any pain at all, psychological or physical, there'd be no problem with that. You can grant that conditional. Then you can start arguing about whether animals feel pain or not. But the person you're speaking to knows that you're not being an ideologue, you're not being dogmatic about this, that you're actually working on a conditional claim. So I think conditionals are your friend. Also, you can strive for consistency within people rather than first principles. This is another point, a third, I suppose. Whenever I make a case for caring about animal ethics, very rarely do I say, here is the truth. Here is the way things are. Here is what ethics is, and here's why it commits us to veganism. Instead, I try to find out what another person already believes, and then simply test them for consistency. You'll have seen this in action as well. If somebody says, like, you think it's okay to put a pig into a gas chamber, but it's not okay to put a dog into a gas chamber. This is a claim of inconsistency. You're not making the claim that it's either right or wrong to do either of those things. All you're saying is that if it is wrong to force a dog into a gas chamber, then it must also be wrong to force a pig into a gas chamber. And so when a person's arguing with you, you might say, for example, you need to be aware of who you're talking to, right? Because if you're talking to somebody, if I say, well, I wouldn't force an animal into a gas chamber. I wouldn't force a dog into a gas chamber, so I wouldn't force a pig into a gas chamber. Not everyone's going to agree with that. There'll be some people who would just say, actually, you know what, I would force a dog into a gas chamber. You need to be ready for that. And then you can test them for consistency in other areas. You can say, well, look, do you think that it's wrong to force a human into a gas chamber? And if they say yes, then ask them why. Why is it the case that that's wrong? Well, maybe because it causes a lot of suffering. Okay, and then you can test for consistency because these animals can also suffer as well. But in other words, you shouldn't be starting, you should be working backwards. You know, don't start from the moral principle and show why it commits a person to veganism. Ask a person what they already believe, and then consider the ways in which it might be inconsistent to hold that belief at the same time as thinking that it's okay to harm animals. So you must be aware of who it is that you're actually talking to. Some people care more about the environment, some people care more about the ethics, some people care more about the health. If you're dealing with an environmentalist, say you're dealing with an environmentalist Christian who thinks that animals are here for our use, and that humans are a very specific kind of animal that are categorically different from other animals. Factory farming could still be pretty egregious for them. I think if we gave Jesus Christ a tour of a factory farm, he'd have some choice words, but in terms of eating animals generally, you might not be able to convince them. But they may be very interested in environmentalism, and so you should put the moral stuff to the side and be talking just about the environmental stuff, and don't be afraid to do that. I mean, to me it seems a bit weird to focus on the environment when we're talking about factory farming. It sounds to me a bit like if we were to view a puppy mill in the distance that was torturing puppies, and I was there with my friend, and my friend said, "That's really, really horrible, that's so bad." I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Just look at the fumes, they're so bad for the environment." You're not wrong, you're not incorrect, but it feels like you're kind of missing the point here. But if talking about the fumes is the only way that I'm going to convince that person to come down with me and try and put it to an end, then talk about the environment I will. So be aware of who you're talking to and look for consistency, and don't be afraid of using conditionals. One really important thing is the concept of pride, which is often described as one of the worst sins in a religious context. C.S. Lewis describes pride in Mere Christianity as one of the worst sins that a person can commit. And in fact, he notes how pride can often devalue our attempts to be moral in other areas. He imagines in a Christian context a person who says, "I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to cheat, I'm not going to thieve, I'm not going to engage in casual sex, I'm not going to do any of this kind of stuff." Very Christian. They say, "I'm not going to do any of that because, I'm above that. That's not me." C.S. Lewis says that what that person has done is they've traded these various menial sins for a much worse sin, which is pride, because they've said, "I'm not going to do this because I'm above it. These things are below me." It's kind of, again, self-congratulatory, and it's the kind of pride that Christians will want to avoid, because pride is what engenders sin. Because if you think that you're above something, then you're much more likely to be susceptible to engaging in it. I gave a talk once called "Why Smart People Believe Silly Things," and it was about the concept of how the smarter a person is, I think the more susceptible they are to holding ridiculous beliefs. You think it might be the other way around, but if you're a smart person, you're much more able to rationalize your beliefs. And not only are you able to rationalize bad beliefs, but also because if you're smart and you know you're smart, you're going to think to yourself, "Well, I'm not the kind of person that's susceptible to stupid beliefs, because I'm a smart guy." But the surefire way to make sure that you are the most susceptible person in the room to a bad idea is to think that you're not susceptible to it. If you're aware of the fact that you're susceptible to a bad belief, if you're aware of the fact that, I am the kind of person that can fall for this kind of nonsense, then you're more likely to be on the lookout for it, and therefore more able to avoid it. And pride works in a similar way. If you stop doing something and do it with a sense of pride, pride itself brings about more of the kind of sins that you originally got rid of. Because if you're a prideful person who says, "I'm a good person, I'm above all that," then just like the smart person and the silly beliefs, you're less likely to realize how susceptible you are to committing these evils, and therefore more likely to commit them, more likely to fall for them, more likely to not realize that you're committing an evil altogether. So when we're talking about veganism, it's very important not to be prideful about it. It's very important. Like a lot of people like to say, "I'm doing this for the animals." And that may be true, but constantly asserting that fact, you have to be very careful. It's much like the person who asserts that they're a humble person. It's like the moment that you have to say that you're a humble person, you're probably not a very humble person anymore. And the same thing happens here. If you're constantly talking about how, I'm above all that evil, I'm much better than all of that, and I'm doing this for the animals, and you're sort of promoting this, and people can tell if this is coming from a place of pride. And I think we need to be very careful to avoid it, because people can see that, and it really does kind of put people off. It's something that people notice, and we need to be aware of it. Tied into this, similar, I suppose, is the concept of dogma. Dogma is a word that's thrown around a lot. Dogma is very bad. People don't like holding dogmatic beliefs, but people can hold good beliefs dogmatically. Dogma is just a principle or set of principles that is held unquestioningly. It's a set of principles that's unquestioned and unquestionable. But nothing in the definition of dogma entails that the contents of the dogma have to be negative. All it means is that the principle is held without being questioned. You can hold good beliefs dogmatically. For example, I think most people of a younger generation are not racist, but they probably are so dogmatically. And we're one of the first generations in human history that's been taught from childhood, essentially, that racism is wrong. And there are given some surface level reasons. People say, you shouldn't judge someone on their skin color, this kind of thing. And children are like, okay, cool, yeah, I'll internalize that. But it's essentially dogmatic. Now, it's a good belief, I'm glad you hold that belief. But have you ever questioned it? Now, it might raise an eyebrow to say, well, is it really wrong? But if you don't do that at least once in your life, then what happens when you encounter a real racist? What happens? What happens when you suddenly realize that you just hold this belief because you've been taught it, and even if it's correct, even if it's moral, you don't know how to defend it because you held it dogmatically. Eliminating dogma doesn't mean eliminating the beliefs that you hold dogmatically. You can keep some of the same beliefs, it just means that you don't hold them dogmatically anymore. But you can still hold those same beliefs. So a lot of the time, this kind of stuff happens in veganism because we just hold beliefs like animal cruelty is wrong, or you think it's not dogmatic because you think, well, I wouldn't force a pig into a gas chamber, and I know why. It's because I wouldn't do it to a dog. But why not? Why? That might seem immediately obvious to you. Of course I wouldn't do that. But the beliefs that are the most obvious to you, the ones that seem the least in need of questioning, are the ones that are most in need of questioning. For similar reasons, like the smart person and silly belief type thing, like these are the most important ones that you need to question, because these are the fundamental bases upon which you're building the rest of your philosophy. And if you hold it dogmatically, you're not going to be able to communicate it right. Because much in the same way that if you hold a good belief, like not being a racist, but you hold it dogmatically, you meet the racist, and they might beat you in a debate. They might actually win, not because they're right, of course, but because they've thought about how to respond to these questions. They've thought about how to communicate their ideas in a way that you haven't. And it's the same trap that you might fall into if you hold these beliefs dogmatically about veganism. You must always search for the legitimacy also in what a person's saying. Because when a person is making a point, even if it's a bad point, there's a reason why they've made it. There's a reason why they think that. And I think it's important to try to identify that within a person, such that if somebody comes to you and says something that seems absolutely outrageous and ridiculous, somebody just says, animal cruelty just doesn't matter, I just don't care about it. Animals don't suffer. Don't take it as an opportunity to scoff at them, take it as an opportunity to be like, okay, right, well, maybe they don't. Let's reevaluate this. Let's get rid of this if it's dogma in my thinking, because you said something to me which seems just obviously, immediately wrong. But if I can't tell you why it's obviously wrong, then maybe it's not that obvious at all, and it deserves reevaluating. So you can use it as an opportunity for reevaluation when you want to just scoff at a person. One final thing I want to say, and I want to leave a bit of time for questions, actually, because I wasn't quite sure what to talk to you all about, because, as I say, I think we're in vague agreement about the actual ethics here, but if anybody has any questions, I want to leave time to answer them. But one final thing, I guess, another tip when it comes to vegan communication here is, I guess it's important, if you can, to find another hobby. Because I'm somebody who does this professionally. I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. But even in my professional career, I try not to just talk about this. And I think we have a right to always talk about it. It's incredibly important, and I understand why people would want to do that. But there are two reasons why we might want to consider, and I don't mean you shouldn't make this the focal point of your career or something. But if it is the focal point of your career, you should have a life outside of your career. Firstly, because you can become consumed by it, and the problems with that are myriad. Firstly, you become desensitized. So, for example, you no longer are really moved when you think about animal suffering, because you're dealing with it every single day. You see footage every single day. And so now when you look at factory farm footage, you don't feel a thing. You're essentially numb to it. That's not a good thing. If you don't feel the passion anymore, it's going to be more difficult to communicate your message with people. So you should take some time off, spend some time outside of your career, go on holiday, spend time with your families, play some video games, whatever it is, refresh your brain. In my professional career, the reason why I try not to just talk about veganism all the time is partly due to the fact that I feel like people kind of stop listening if you're not careful, because you become a bit of a one-trick pony. Think of your favorite vegan influencer, YouTuber, someone like this, who just makes vegan content all the time. It's great. It's good resources to have. But even if you're subscribed to them, even if you support them, even if you're donating money to them because you think what they're doing is so important, if they upload a video that's like, the biggest contributor to ocean pollution that nobody's talking about, it's like, wonder what that is, wonder what that could be. You're probably not even going to click on that because you know what this person's going to say. And so there's a sort of a professional reason to keep people guessing, because you want them to actually be interested in what you have to say, such that when you ask a question about veganism or animal treatment, they don't actually know that you're just going to start talking about the basic vegan message over and over again. So that's another reason why it's important to find another hobby, but also it's important to show people that they can take this kind of ethic on board without it consuming them. You can be careful to explain to a person why it's consumed you, why you spend so much time talking about it, but you need to demonstrate that it's possible to just be a perfectly otherwise average, normal human being who spends all their time working a normal job, spending time with friends and family, this kind of thing, but also just cares very deeply about this cause and finds the time to make noise about it and believes in it, and you need to show people that it's possible to do that too. It's a little bit different if you're a professional activist, if that's your job, because that is your job. But then I would definitely recommend making sure that you don't let it consume you and that you spend some time resensitizing yourself to the issues, and that will make you more effective at communicating them. But as somebody has put a timer up here for 17 minutes, and something about it's quite menacing. It's telling me that maybe it's time to move on to some questions. Thank you for listening so far. But if anybody has any questions, please do raise your hand, and I would love to be engaging. So I think somebody's got a microphone that's going to be handed around.
Hello, my name is Magnus, and I've experienced through activism and debates in the past that people, they ask me what my credentials are and who I am to define what constitutes good and bad beliefs, and what authority I have to define that, for example, killing animals is a bad belief. And so what mediates that? Is it humility or empathy, or perhaps in the context of veganism, connecting with the animals on a personal level?
I think if somebody asks you, what are your credentials here to define what animal suffering is, or whether it's right or wrong to kill an animal, who are you to say that? Well, who are they? They hold moral beliefs too, don't they? They must think that certain things are right and wrong, unless they're a real moral nihilist, but you don't come by many of those. If they hold a belief like it's wrong to kill other human beings, who the hell are they to judge that? Now you might say, well, it's different because you're trying to sort of impose your belief on them that they don't hold. But I'm pretty sure they would quite quickly try to impose their own moral beliefs if you tried to kill them, or one of their friends. Now, who the hell are they to do that? Well, okay, they hold this belief. That's just a fact. Now you hold this belief. Look, we're in the same position now. Now all we're doing is testing for consistency. I'm not going along to people and saying, look, I have the authority to dictate ethics, and I'm going to tell you what's right. It's what I was saying a moment ago about working from consistency rather than basic principles. If I wanted to do the base principles thing, then I'd have to do what this person is asking of you. I'd have to say, here's why my ethical theory is correct. Here's why you need to believe it, and here's why it commits you to being a vegan. But if you're just testing for consistency, you say, look, I don't care what I believe. Like, my ethical theory is in fact perfectly irrelevant because I'm just working on what you believe right now. If I meet somebody you might meet someone who's a utilitarian. Now, okay, I'm not a utilitarian. Okay, so my two choices are either to say why a different ethical theory is correct, or I can say, that doesn't matter. You're a utilitarian, so now let's see if utilitarianism commits you to veganism. Because then if they're asking you, well, who are you to say what's right and wrong? It's like, I'm not the one who said it, you are. You're the utilitarian. You're the one who thinks that suffering minimization is the right thing to do. All I'm injecting here is a factual claim, not a moral claim, just a descriptive claim that factory farming causes suffering, and you're just already committed to the view that factory farming should be avoided. So the way to avoid the charge of being some kind of moral dictator is to not be one, is to work on the other person's ethical theory. And if they ask you, who are you to make these claims? Well, they either have to abandon their right to make any moral criticism of anybody ever, or they have to accept that this is something that everybody does.
Thank you.
New question. Hi, I'm Hans from the Vegan Society in Norway. And you were already talking about like burnout and empathy fatigue, which is a very important thing to talk about for people who do this. I don't know what this is, but everything we do, I guess. At which point do you know that you've done enough? Because it's impossible for me to know when I'm not like tearing down myself in the process of doing good, I guess.
That's a difficult question. I think we can console ourselves in the knowledge that, like, if we go out of our way to avoid inflicting suffering where we can, then I think we've committed our duty. We're sort of paying the price for human existence. Everything else I would consider as a good thing to do, a virtuous thing to do on top. It's much like giving to charity, you know. Seems like a virtuous thing to do, but it's very difficult to know when you've done enough. It's very difficult to know when you've donated enough that you shouldn't donate any more. But a lot of people shy away from the idea of saying that it's in any way a moral duty to give to charity. Of course, a great deal of utilitarians, effective altruists, these kinds of people do think that it's a moral obligation. But it's at least plausible that giving to charity is a positive good, or giving money to a homeless person on the street is a positive good that you're not technically obligated to do. It would just be a good thing. Now, if you are deciding that you do want to give money to this homeless person, you give them $5, euros, pounds, whatever. What is it here? Yeah. Whatever. Let's go with dollars. And you think, well, I could have given them 10. Okay, sure, you're going to be having these thoughts of like, oh, how do I know if I've done enough? But console yourself in the knowledge that you could have given them nothing, right? And so, you know, take a breather. If you're getting to the point where you're regularly thinking about whether or not you're doing enough, that might be an indication itself that you're already doing too much, that you're already getting a bit burnt out because you're running around thinking, gosh, couldn't I be doing more? Couldn't I be doing more? It's like, if that's stressing you out, maybe you're already doing a bit too much. I don't know, man. I think it's got to be an individual question, because if you start comparing yourself to other people, bear in mind that like I do this professionally, right? Or at least I make videos and podcasts and things professionally, and that involves talking about veganism a lot. So I can afford the time to give talks, and not only that, I can also afford the time after a talk to relax and take my mind off the issue, because it's not like I have a job that I then have to go and do. This is my job. And so a lot of people will look at people going around giving talks and doing street activism and stuff, and they forget that this is all they do. This is what they do full time. And so they feel measly by comparison. The only thing that I think we have an obligation to do here is to avoid inflicting suffering where we can. Everything else is a positive good. And it's not a very good answer, but I'm afraid I just can't really, I can't really tell you when it is that you've done enough. I guess I can say that just by being a vegan, you've done enough on paper in terms of your moral duty. Everything else is a virtue.
Yeah, sorry, I'm over here.
Aha.
Hi.
Hey.
I thought that was a really good question, because I struggled a lot, especially when I was young, figuring out, not only with like animal welfare, but also the environment. There's all these industries that we contribute to. And I figured, there's not much we can do if we're having, lack of energy and taking from our own, battery of wanting to do good. So I think I figured, got this thought from this question, your great answer, that I found this point of, if I'm using your metaphor of giving to a homeless person, if I'm taking from the money that I'm using to buy my own food, then how am I going to do the activism tomorrow? So that's basically how I kind of made a rule for myself that, you know, you can, doing good is always good, but if you do so much that there's nothing left of yourself, then you're not going to keep that going for long.
Yeah, that's right. That's why people burn out, right?
Yeah.
I think what we need to pay attention to here is sort of cost to impact ratio. As you say, it might be a good thing to do, but maybe the impact that you're going to have is negligible to the ethical cause compared to the impact that you're going to have on yourself. It's a similar question to choosing which ethical issues in particular to focus on. So I spend a lot of time talking about animal ethics, and people like to ask, well, why that? Why that? Why not human slavery? There are more human beings in slavery now than at any point in human history. Surely this is something that requires a lot of attention. What about environmentalism? I don't really talk about that either. Sure, but there are a great many environmental campaigners who are making a lot of noise all around the globe. Now, I could contribute my voice to that and it might make a difference, but the percentage difference compared to what's already there is probably going to be quite small. Whereas when it comes to animal ethics, the moral case for abolishing factory farms, that seems far less common to me. And so my intrinsic impact in terms of, let's say, the number of people who listen to me or something like that, might be exactly the same. If I talked about environmentalism, same number of people in the audience. Moral case for getting rid of factory farms, same number of people in the audience. But as a percentage difference of the impact that I actually have, the second's going to be far better. It's going to have much more net utility, and so I choose to do that for that reason. The same thing's going to be true here of your sort of cost ratio. Sure, you could like save a person's life by donating some money to the Against Malaria Foundation, but if you keep that money and become an activist and convince other people to donate money and convince governments to increase their aid spending, then you might have saved a lot more lives than that. There's not going to be a formula for working out what the actual right answer to that is, but I think we should take refuge in the fact that we'll never know the exact answer, and that as long as we're conscious of it and trying to remain aware as much as we can, that we're certainly doing much more than many others would be doing, which is worth celebrating, I think. There's one down the front here, or, oh yeah.
Yes, hi, I'm Carl, I'm from Canada, and thanks for speaking English. I appreciate it. Yeah, my question is like, how do you know you're in pride? I think it can be hard to figure out. Sometimes I talk to people and I think they thought I was in pride. They're like, yeah, you're vegan, huh? You know the answers. And if it's so, if you are in pride, how do you work on that?
It's difficult because there's two things there. There's the question of when you appear prideful to other people, even if you're not, and there's the question of recognizing when you are in fact actually being prideful. If you can notice if you're prideful in a number of ways. It's like, for example, if you were writing an essay or as a YouTube video or something, like sometimes I'll make a YouTube video and I'm advocating for an ethical cause, and I might ask myself a question like, would I take this script that I've written and give it to Earthling Ed and get him to read it out and post it and claim that it was his own work? Okay, there might be some complicated questions in terms of like, well, am I going to be able to make money if I'm not doing my job or whatever, but let's say it's something I'm doing extra on the side. If the answer to that question is no, then why am I writing that essay? Why is it that I'm trying to put that information out in the world if I wouldn't freely, without hesitation, just let somebody else say it too? Maybe it's because I'm not putting it out because I care about the cause, but because I enjoy the fact that my voice is getting out there, or because I like the fact that people are listening to me. Ask yourself, would you do the same thing with anonymity? And if you wouldn't, then I think there's potentially a problem. If people accuse you of being prideful, you might want to get defensive. You might say, no, I'm not, but that's not going to get you very far. I think one of the things that you can do in that situation is recognize immediately the severity of what they're claiming. If they say, I think this is coming from a place of pride, don't be like, no, or be like, maybe, I'm not sure, whatever. Be like, well, this is actually something I spend a lot of time thinking about. And you're right to point it out, and if I am, I want you to tell me how I'm doing that, because it is something that I want to avoid. Demonstrate that it's something that you have thought about before and that you're trying to be aware of, and ask them in all sincerity, what is it that's giving you that impression? And listen to them, right? Because they might be right. I think if somebody accuses you of being prideful, in other words, ask them to explain how, and maybe you'll find out that you are being prideful. But recognizing it in yourself, I think the best trick is probably to imagine that anonymity and consider whether you'd still be doing what you were doing if you got out. Or imagine if you would still be doing what you were doing if everybody hated you for it. And not in a romantic way that you get a lot of hate, but people kind of like it because you're getting a lot of hate and you become a bit of a hero that are hated. I mean, like everything, or let's say indifferent, because that's worse. It's worse to have people being indifferent to your message than hating it, because people hating on you is a bit of a character trait, I think. If you would, everything you say just sort of falls on deaf ears and is totally neutral, or if you were anonymous, same effect on your individual person, would you still be doing it? If the answer is no, then you need to rethink that. And also, are you actually going to change your mind? If you're not going into every conversation thinking that you might genuinely change your mind, you're debating somebody trying to convince them of veganism. If you don't actually genuinely believe that you might come out of that conversation no longer vegan, then something's gone wrong there, and you're not really dedicated to the conversation.
Okay, Per-Ola has the last question. That was but you will stay for the gala and
Oh yeah,
people
I'll be here all evening.
can talk to you. Okay, Per-Ola.
Okay, I'm also known as Vegan Dragon, YouTuber.
Applauding me for drinking later. It's fantastic.
Okay.
I like it.
Yeah, I'm known for Vegan Dragon on YouTube, tiny channel. I've been a fan for you a long time, long before you started talking about veganism. But I saw your debate with Michaela Peterson, and I was so disappointed. Like, not only did you say things like talking about like if it's more practical for you to eat meat and call it vegan, you also said that if shooting an elk would reduce suffering, then go ahead and shoot an elk and call yourself vegan for whatever I care. These like reducitarian, utilitarian arguments. But you also named a trait which you can actually bring the other way around. So I want to ask you, what is it that's true of an animal that, if true of a human, would make it okay to remove a human's right to life because it's more practical for a certain individual, and it would also reduce suffering?
In 1 minute and 57 seconds.
I know.
Yeah, a lot of people were disappointed with that conversation. As I said, you've got to be aware of who you're talking to. Michaela Peterson's audience are very similar to Jordan Peterson's audience, and I didn't think it'd be very effective communication if we were to get into too much of a debate. And in fact, many of the comments said, what I was essentially going for was the kind of comment that says something like, man, I usually hate vegans, but this guy's all right. Something like that. Trying to build a bridge. Michaela's coming on my podcast, and I was hoping to actually address these exact problems, because when she's on my turf, it's much more of an opportunity to debate this kind of stuff. On the name the trait point, the difficulty, I think, here, because you're quite right to point out that, well, for a start, as I say, I'm interested in the reducing of animal suffering here. So a lot of people said, oh, that's a bit too utilitarian for me, like you're not really, you've disappointed me because you're not sort of basing this on rights. It's like, well, I never did that. And maybe we just have a disagreement about the nature of ethics. If you think animals have a right to life and it's very important to respect that right more than it's important to reduce suffering or something, I'd love to know how it is that you ground rights. What are rights? Where are they? How do they exist? How does a person get them? What has rights and what don't? This kind of stuff. This is important, because I don't think that this kind of stuff can apply. I think rights are a useful concept that we use to minimize suffering in the long haul. That is something like rural utilitarianism. And so I made a video a while ago about animals having a right to life in the same way that humans do. I don't think that they can, because if they did, we'd have to starve ourselves. And the reason for that is that, imagine that situation where I can shoot an elk. Let's imagine that by shooting that elk, and of course this can't be true of like how the whole world eats, it's just this particular situation. I can go and hunt that elk. Well, let's say my other option is to eat some imported vegan food that involved multiple animals dying in the crop death production and also environmental pollution from it traveling. What's the right thing for me to do there? Is it to eat that elk, or is it to demand that food? Now, for me, it's very simple. I want to have the least or the minimal impact on animal suffering that I can. And so if by shooting that elk, I'm going to cause less animal suffering and less animals are going to die as well, then I think that that's the right thing to do. Whether or not that's the vegan thing to do, is another question. I understand why people would say that it's not. But the objection might be something like, well, you wouldn't do that to a human being, would you? Well, the thing is, I wouldn't do that to a human being, but I also wouldn't eat vegan food if it involved killing human beings in order to produce crops. People have pointed out that in crop deaths, it's kind of accidental death, rather than intentionally taking the life of an animal in order to eat food. That's not always the case. We use pesticides, we destroy habitats, farmers will purposefully kill animals to prevent them from destroying their crops. And so, if a human being, if the only way for me to eat some crops were for me to go and kill another human being and take their food or something, if that was what was involved in eating food, we've got a choice to make. We either say that human beings have a right to life that we can't violate and therefore we starve ourselves, or we say that we can actually kill that human being because it's a situation of survival. Whichever one you say, I just think you need to be consistent with animals as well. So for me, if there is such thing as a right to life that human beings have, what makes something a right is that it's inviolable. That's what a right is. It's a moral principle that cannot be violated. And that means that even if I'm going to starve, I don't get to kill a human being to eat that food. Okay, now the question is, do animals have the same right? Do they have that same thing? Well, if they did, it would mean that I couldn't kill animals in the same situation. So that means even if I needed to in order to survive, I couldn't kill an animal in order to produce food for me. If that's the case, then we'd have to starve to death. Now, you're welcome to choose what you like. Maybe you think that they do have that right to life, but then you're not going to be able to eat even vegan food because you're killing animals, and again, intentionally, in the production of food. And the fact that you're not eating the animals directly that you're killing and they're just dying in the crop production is much the same as the fact that you don't eat the chicken that you're harming to get the egg. It's about harming animals in the production of that food. So I just don't think that this concept of a right to life exists of these animals. And so that would be the trait. It requires a bit more justification, but I'm trying to keep this condensed, but we can talk about this afterwards as well. But I consider rights to be a useful shorthand that don't actually exist. They're not real things. The right to life is a bit like saying the gun is always loaded. It's not always loaded, but we're going to adopt that into our ethical, we're going to adopt that ethical maxim that the gun is always loaded because it's going to be much better for us in the long run. Rights do the same thing, but I don't think the same thing can be applied to non-human animals for a variety of reasons, including the one that I've just given. But we can talk more about that afterwards. But yeah, I suppose that would be the trait.
Thank you for the food for thought, and here you can show on this.
Lovely. Thanks so much. That's super. Thank you.